Before we get started, I wanted to let everybody know that I have a new book that is available on Kindle, and it is called Recommended Reading for the True Conservative. 50 pages long, and if you have Kindle Unlimited, you can read it for free. Other than that, it's $3.99. So again, that is Recommended Reading for the True Conservative. And now, on with the podcast.
time travel, like if I went back in time, knowing everything I know now, I don't think I would make a difference. I don't think you would even hear about it. If I went back to the 20s and I saw some guy on an old phone, I would be like, hey, eventually they have phones you just carry in your pocket. And he'd be like, yeah, how do they do it? It's like, I don't know. I don't know how they're doing it. It's like a satellite or something. And they're like, what's a satellite? Well, I shouldn't have even brought that up then. It's like a round.
Good morning. It's Saturday, Rules Saturday, May the 16th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have no free lunch and rules for retrogrades. All that and more when I get back. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. Now, there's no free lunch. 250 Economic Truths by David Bahnsen.
If time is money, then interest rates are the price of time. John Malden. What a simple but eloquent way to understand what interest rates are and why they exist. Our money has a purpose now. To part with our money, either because of lending it out for someone else's use or investing it in the equity reward of a business or project, means a delay in that purpose. The interest rate is the price we set on the time we will be parted from our money.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. This confusion is by design. It destabilizes the conservative sense of reality and keeps the liberal in the superior position. Through seduction, they create desire. Through withdrawal, they maintain control. The oscillation between the two ensures that the conservative is never secure, never settled, always reaching for something just out of reach. Shame and confusion are two of the most powerful tools in the liberal's arsenal of manipulation, particularly in the context of intimacy. Unlike overt abuse, these tactics often go unnoticed, operating in subtle, insidious ways that leave the conservative questioning their own perception and worth. The liberal uses shame to diminish, to destabilize, and to assert dominance, while confusion serves to keep the conservative disoriented and compliant. These are not accidental byproducts. They are deliberate strategies designed to fracture the conservative self-image and make them easier to control. Shame is often instilled through backhanded compliments, critical remarks disguised as jokes, or sudden coldness following moments of vulnerability. For example, a liberal might subtly criticize the conservative, never overtly, not enough to provoke open confrontation, but just enough to make the conservative feel inadequate or exposed. Over time, the conservative internalizes these judgments, believing they are not good enough. The narcissist exploits this vulnerability, reinforcing the idea that the conservative must work harder, change more, or suppress parts of themselves to be worthy of respect. Confusion is layered on top of this shame through gaslighting, inconsistency, and contradiction. The liberal may say one thing and do another, deny obvious truths, or rewrite history to fit their narrative. The conservative begins to doubt their memory, their instincts, and even their values. They lose confidence in their own judgment and increasingly refer to the liberal's version of reality. This confusion erodes autonomy and makes it nearly impossible to draw clear boundaries or make empowered choices. The conservative often finds themselves in a state of paralysis, ashamed of who they are and confused about what is happening. This psychological fog keeps them tied to the liberal, believing that the problem lies within themselves, that if they can just be better, things will be all right. But that was a manipulation and a trap designed to set the stage for long-term emotional control through the persistent use of shame and confusion. The liberal is a master of mirroring, particularly early on. This skill allows them to create an uncanny sense of resonance and connection, as if they intuitively understand the conservative's desires, fears, and needs. But this mirroring is not a reflection of genuine empathy or emotional depth. It's a calculated tactic used to create attachment and dependency. The liberal observes, studies, and reflects back what the conservative wants to see, crafting an illusion of compatibility and cooperation. They become exactly what the conservative expects. This is not connection, it is manipulation, and its purpose is control. Once the liberal has embedded themselves in the conservative psyche, they begin to weaponize what was once offered freely. Cooperation becomes conditional. The liberal leverages the knowledge they've gained through mirroring to exploit the conservative's insecurities and emotional triggers. They may use the conservatives' vulnerabilities as ammunition during conflicts or to subtly erode their confidence. The liberal is not just using generic strategies, they are using the conservatives' own desires and emotional blueprint against them. They would hold back precisely what the conservative values most. They mock or ignore the very qualities they once praised, and they do so while maintaining enough ambiguity and intermittent reinforcement to keep the conservative hooked. This weaponization of cooperation is one of the most emotionally violent aspects of liberal abuse. It strikes at the core of identity, at the human need to be seen. The conservative feels needed and discarded, often within the same breath. They are left wondering if the problem lies with them, when in reality, the liberal was never seeking cooperation, they were seeking leverage. The healing process requires a deliberate act of reclaiming responsibility, not for the liberal's behavior, but for one's own sense of self-boundaries. It's a shift from asking, why did they do this to me, to asking, what do I need to see clearly now, and how do I protect myself going forward? Boundaries are essential in this process. The liberal thrives in environments where boundaries are porous or inconsistent. They exploit guilt, obligation, and confusion to maintain access and influence. Recovery demands the building of strong internal lines, clear limits on what's acceptable, what is tolerable, and what will never again be allowed. These boundaries must be rooted not in fear, but in self-respect. That means learning to say no without explanation, to walk away without seeking closure, and to trust one's own perception, even in the face of pressure or doubt. This isn't about blame. It's about empowerment. It's about recognizing how one's own patterns, beliefs, or wounds may have made them susceptible to liberal manipulation and choosing to grow beyond those vulnerabilities. This stage of recovery is often marked by grief because it involves mourning, not just the relationship, but the illusions that kept it alive. This includes cultivating self-trust, practicing emotional honesty, and engaging in relationships where mutual respect and empathy are present. It is a process of unlearning the idea that respect must be earned through suffering or that attention must be chased and negotiated. True healing comes not from defeating the narcissist, but from stepping entirely out of the game they play and refusing to participate in the emotional economy they depend on. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, rules for retrogrades.
Rule 38. Under no circumstances let radicals control the rules of the game. If an active participant in a game were able to set the game's rules in real time, and if he were at the same time an unscrupulous man, in his zeal to win he'd certainly concoct rules favorable to himself, all but ensuring his victory. Unilateral power to set rules imbues the rulemaker with godlike invincibility. Scenarios such as these are thinly veiled Calvin Ball, the game from Calvin and Hobbes, where the main character Calvin initiates an endless series of rule changes, all designed to set himself up to win. In war, you don't let your enemy dictate the terms of the battle to you. If you want to give yourself the best chance of achieving victory, you fight on your own terms. If possible, you don't fight in the enemy's chosen setting. You fight on your own terrain. You don't fight with weapons favored by the enemy. You fight with the weapons he fears most. You don't fight him at a time when he expects it. You fight him at the time he least expects it. You don't fight with tactics the enemy prefers. You fight him with tactics of which he's ignorant. Radicals have long been dictating to conservatives our rules of engagement, the rules controlling the outcome of our battle. Radicals have made a habit out of dictating those topics which are acceptable in public discourse. Through the bludgeon of political correctness, they've assumed the power to tell us what language we can use and what language we can't use when describing a problem. We can no longer speak our minds with clear diction. Instead, we're told to use muddled niceties out of sensitivity to the feelings of an ostensible victim class. Yet radicals can spew vitriol at retrogrades with impunity. Under the present Calvin Ball regime, for radicals, dissent against an unfavored administration is patriotic. On the other hand, when retrogrades dissent against an administration favored by radicals, it's an affront to the dignity of the office. Radicals can stage sit-ins and occupy vast areas of critical urban centers for weeks at a time to protest income inequality, but retrogrades must have a buffer zone to pray in front of abortion clinics. Radicals are free to hold gay pride parades in any locale in the nation, but retrogrades have to fight tooth and nail to get a permit for a straight pride parade in one city. Bigotry against Christians and Jews is openly embraced by radicals. Yet, if a retrograde so much as hints that Islam may be prone to violence, they are branded as hateful and Islamophobic. In fact, anytime a retrograde reproaches some evil that radicals favor, we're called phobic for doing so, e.g. homophobic, Islamophobic, fatphobic, transphobic, and xenophobic. Retrogrades have allowed ourselves to be hapless victims of bullying for too long, acting like the overly passive friend who knows his peer is cheating at a board game, but does nothing about it. This paradigm must be altered, and it must be altered fast. If retrogrades are to prevail in the ongoing political cultural war, we cannot resign ourselves to sheepishness in the face of radical imperiousness. There's nothing to stop us from insisting on our own set of rules. And when radicals are forced to play on our turf, let's see who prevails.
And that was Rule 38 from Rules for Retrogrades, 40 Tactics to Defeat the Radical Left by Timothy J. and David R. Gordon. Back in a minute. Thank you. So the president's trip to China is a great example of gray area thinking. The whole reason he went to China is because of gray area thinking. If he was not brainwashed in a gray area thinking kind of mode, he wouldn't have gone to China. The Chinese communists are our mortal enemies. That's all there is to it. They want to destroy us. They've always wanted to destroy us. They want to destroy us today, and they will always want to destroy us as long as they exist. You don't go over to your enemy's house and celebrate and sit down and break bread and have, make speeches. You don't do that. That is our enemy. Maybe we'll celebrate once the Communist Party in China is dead. But until then, we stay home and we mind our own business. But somebody got to President Trump and told him, yeah, it's true that they're communist, and yes, we hate communists, and yes, communists want us dead, but wouldn't it be smarter if? Wouldn't it be better if? Okay, so they create that gray area in order to manipulate the president into doing something he really shouldn't do. So the trip to communist China was a win for Xi Jinping. It was a win for Communist China, and a win for the Chinese Communist Party, and a win for communism in general. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now the Mossad.
The train platform at Bahnhof Zoo was nearly empty at 11:47 on a Tuesday night in October 1983. Daniel Roth stood under the flickering fluorescent lights, watching three men close in from different directions with the precision of a collapsing net. He'd made a mistake. Not today. Not yesterday. 3 weeks ago, when he'd filed a routine travel permit to visit his supposed cousin in Dresden. An administrative formality he'd completed dozens of times before. Except this time, some junior clerk in the East German bureaucracy had flagged it. Not because it was suspicious, because it was statistically irregular. His travel pattern didn't quite match the behavioral profile they'd built over 5 years of surveillance data, a deviation of 0.73%, meaningless to a human analyst, visible to a computer system designed to catch exactly that kind of anomaly. The men weren't moving quickly. They didn't need to. The westbound train had already departed. The next one wouldn't arrive for 18 minutes. Roth's hand went to his coat pocket, felt the crumpled copy of the travel permit he should never have been able to see. The one with the red notation in the margin. Überprüfung erforderlich. Verification required. His Mossad handler had shoved it into his hand 4 hours earlier during an emergency dead drop at the Tiergarten, breaking every protocol they'd maintained for half a decade. The message was simple and absolute. You're burned. 96 hours until every exit closes. We're getting you out. Except the extraction plan they'd rehearsed assumed weeks of preparation. Safe houses pre-staged, documentation prepared, exit routes mapped and tested. What they had instead was 3 days in a city where every intelligence service in the Cold War maintained active surveillance operations. The man approaching from the north entrance wore a gray coat. East German state security, almost certainly. The two coming from the south looked like West German federal intelligence, but in Berlin appearances were part of the deception. Everyone watched everyone. Borders existed on maps, but dissolved in practice when it came to intelligence operations. Roth had exactly 90 seconds to decide. Follow the protocol Mossad had drilled into him. Wait for contact. Never improvise. Trust the extraction team. Or violate everything they'd taught him and disappear into the one direction none of them expected. He chose the second option. Roth turned and walked directly towards the gray coat, closing the distance instead of running from it. The man's expression shifted. Confusion, then calculation. Close quarters interception hadn't been his assignment. He was supposed to observe and confirm identity, nothing more. Roth passed within 2 feet of him, close enough to smell cigarette smoke on the man's jacket, and kept walking toward the station's northeast exit. The kind of aggressive, confident movement that suggested official business rather than evasion. Behind him, he heard the surveillance team's coordination break down. Radio chatter, hesitation, the sound of footsteps stopping instead of pursuing. In Berlin, different services maintained different jurisdictions. If Roth was moving with purpose toward the British sector checkpoint, maybe he had authorization they weren't aware of. Maybe this was an approved operation. The gray coat's momentary confusion bought Roth 40 seconds. Enough to reach the street. Enough to vanish into the late-night foot traffic near the Europa Center. 3,000 miles away in Tel Aviv, a red light appeared on a monitoring board at Mossad headquarters. The emergency beacon Roth carried, a modified pacemaker that transmitted a distress pulse every 12 minutes, had just changed frequency. Their asset was mobile without authorization. The extraction clock, already running, just accelerated. Before we find out what happens next in those desperate 96 hours, I want to let you know what this channel is really about. Every single day, I bring you real intelligence operations. Not Hollywood fantasies, but actual tradecraft, genuine espionage techniques, and the stories that never made headlines precisely because they worked. This is Operation Grey Morning, and it's one of the most compressed, desperate extraction operations in modern intelligence history. If you're fascinated by how spy agencies actually operate when everything goes wrong, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because what happens next in Berlin will show you exactly why Mossad's doctrine prioritizes survival over glory, and why the operations you never hear about are often the most important ones. Oh, and real quick, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment below with your city and country. Are you in New York, London, Tel Aviv, Tokyo? It's always incredible to see how far these intelligence stories reach across the globe. Let me know where you're hearing this story unfold. Now, back to Berlin. Daniel Roth, if that was even his real name, had just violated every extraction protocol Mossad had ever taught him. And in doing so, he'd bought himself one night of survival. But the clock was still running. 71 hours remained until every border crossing, every airport, every railway checkpoint received updated watch lists with his biometric data. Mossad's extraction team was moving, but they'd just lost control of their own operation. The apartment Roth reached at 1:15 in the morning wasn't on any Mossad safehouse list. It was a fallback location he'd memorized during training, but never expected to use. A third-floor walk-up in Kreuzberg, owned by a Turkish family who rented rooms to students and asked no questions. He paid 2 weeks advance in Deutsche Marks, gave a false name, and locked the door. His training said to wait for contact. His instincts said Mossad's communication network was already compromised, which was why the emergency dead drop had been triggered in the first place. Someone inside the intelligence ecosystem had noticed the statistical anomaly, which meant someone was watching for Mossad's response. Roth sat on the narrow bed and forced himself to think through the problem systematically. He'd been operating in Berlin for 5 years under deep cover as a logistics coordinator for a West German pharmaceutical company. His legend was solid. Employment records, tax filings, a girlfriend who didn't know his real background, colleagues who considered him boring. Reliably, predictably boring. That reliability was what had betrayed him. The travel permit to Dresden was the 4th such trip he'd requested that year. The previous 3 had followed an identical pattern, filed 14 days in advance, executed exactly as scheduled, returned precisely when documented. This one had been filed 12 days in advance instead of 14. A change so minor a human analyst would never notice it. But the East German state security had recently implemented a computerized behavioral analysis system designed by Soviet technicians, and the system noticed everything. 0.73% deviation from established pattern, flagged for review. Somewhere in an office in East Berlin, a junior bureaucrat named Werner Müller had done exactly what his job required. He'd noted the irregularity. Named Werner Müller had done exactly what his job required. He'd noted the irregularity, attached a verification request, and forwarded it to the appropriate department. He had no idea he'd just triggered an international intelligence crisis. He'd simply been following procedure. That was the terrifying efficiency of modern surveillance. It wasn't paranoid analysts seeing conspiracies. It was computers identifying statistical anomalies without emotion, without bias, without even understanding what they'd found. Mossad's monitoring systems had detected the flag within 6 hours through their own penetration of East German administrative networks. Not because they had someone inside state security. They didn't. But because they'd compromised the computer systems that shared data between departments. A single line of code, inserted 3 years earlier during a software update, copied every security flag to a ghost server Mossad analysts monitored in real time. When Werner Müller flagged Daniel Roth's travel permit, Mossad knew about it before Müller's supervisor did. The emergency protocol was clear. Once an asset was flagged in a hostile surveillance system, the burn countdown began. East German bureaucracy moved slowly, but it moved inevitably. The verification request would trigger inquiries. Inquiries would trigger surveillance. Surveillance would trigger arrest. The timeline from flag to detention averaged 4 to 6 days based on historical analysis. Mossad gave themselves 96 hours, 4 days, no margin for error. At 3:30 in the morning, while Roth tried to sleep in the Kreuzberg apartment, a Mossad extraction specialist named Yael Shahar landed at Tempelhof Airport on a commercial flight from Paris. Her passport identified her as a French textile buyer. Her luggage contained fabric samples and trade show documentation. Her actual purpose was to coordinate the most compressed extraction operation Mossad had attempted in divided Berlin since the wall went up in 1961. She carried no communication devices, no weapons, no suspicious materials. She was a courier in the purest sense, information moving on biological storage, instructions memorized and never written down, contact protocols that existed. Shahar's assignment was straightforward and nearly impossible. Locate Roth without using any of the compromised communication networks. Establish contact without triggering surveillance. Guide him through a multi-stage extraction that would move him across sector boundaries without documentation that could be traced back to Israel. The challenge wasn't getting Roth out of Berlin. The challenge was making his departure look like something other than an intelligence extraction. Because if hostile services realized they'd lost an embedded asset, they'd analyze everything Roth had touched during his 5 years of operation. They'd identify his intelligence collection targets. They'd roll up his network. They'd compromise operations extending far beyond Berlin. Mossad's doctrine was absolute on this point. Extraction success is measured not by whether you get your asset out, but by whether the enemy knows you got your asset out. Shahar checked into a hotel near Kurfürstendamm and began the surveillance detection route that would consume her entire first day in Berlin. She rode the U-Bahn through 8 different stations, doubled back 3 times, stopped at random shops to examine merchandise she had no intention of buying, and maintained a pace that looked like tourism while executing counter-surveillance techniques designed to identify any following team. By evening, she was confident she was clean, which meant she could begin the actual mission. The dead drop location was a public park bench near the Landwehr Canal, marked with a specific graffiti tag that had been pre-positioned 6 months earlier. Shahar sat for exactly 8 minutes, appearing to read a paperback novel, while her hand found the magnetic key holder attached beneath the bench's metal frame. Inside was a single roll of film containing instructions for Roth's first movement sequence. She left her own package, a coded message confirming she was operational, and departed. The entire exchange took less than 10 minutes. No words spoken, no eye contact made, no electronic signature created. Tradecraft, this careful, was why Mossad's operations stayed invisible. Every step designed to appear accidental. Every movement justified by ordinary behavior. The kind of meticulous operational security that takes years to perfect and seconds to compromise if executed incorrectly. But perfection requires control, and control requires communication. And communication was exactly what Mossad was about to lose. At 7:20 the next morning, a West German federal intelligence officer named Klaus Weber stopped a woman matching Yael Shahar's description at a routine checkpoint near the Charlottenburg Palace. Not because she'd done anything suspicious, because Weber's service had noticed an anomaly of their own. A sudden increase in encrypted radio traffic between Tel Aviv and Berlin over the past 48 hours. They didn't know what it meant, but they knew something was happening. Weber brought Shahar to a small office inside the checkpoint building and asked her to wait while he verified her documentation. Standard procedure, routine questioning. Except Shahar's extraction timeline didn't allow for routine delays. Every hour she spent detained was an hour Roth spent exposed. The interrogation lasted 6 hours. Weber asked about her business in Berlin, her travel plans, her contacts in the city. He was professional, polite, and absolutely thorough. Shahar maintained her cover perfectly, answering questions about textile imports, showing him fabric samples, providing business cards for contacts in the garment district. But she couldn't make contact with Roth, couldn't access the communication network, couldn't coordinate the extraction sequence that was supposed to begin that afternoon. At 2:15 in the afternoon, 64 hours before the extraction deadline, Mossad's Berlin operation went dark. The decision to release Shahar came from above Weber's authority level. A phone call from someone senior who reminded him about operational understandings that existed without documentation. During the Cold War, Western intelligence services maintained informal agreements about Berlin. Don't interfere with each other's operations. Don't force confrontations that serve Soviet interests. Maintain plausible deniability while allowing essential intelligence work to continue. It was the kind of gentleman's understanding that existed in nods, encoded language, never written down, never officially acknowledged. The sort of arrangement that worked precisely because it was never formalized. Weber released Shahar at 8:40 p.m. with an apology and a warning. Whatever operation was running, keep it away from West German interests. The understanding had limits. Shahar walked out of the checkpoint building 14 hours behind schedule. The dead drop she was supposed to service that afternoon had been missed. The contact window with Roth had closed. The extraction timeline was fracturing in real time. And Daniel Roth, waiting in the Kreuzberg apartment with no communication and no guidance, had to make a choice. Follow the protocol that said wait for contact, or trust his training and start moving on his own. The doctrine Mossad had drilled into every asset operating in hostile territory was built on a single principle. If communication breaks down, you are the operation, not Tel Aviv, not your handler, you. Roth had memorized 17 different extraction scenarios during training. None of them matched his current situation perfectly, but all of them shared common elements: movement over stasis, confusion over clarity, force the enemy to react to you instead of waiting for them to find you. At 9:30 p.m., Roth left the Kreuzberg apartment and began executing an extraction sequence Mossad's planners had explicitly avoided in their contingency planning. He was going to cross into the American sector, use a cutout courier he'd established independently 3 years earlier, and create enough chaos in the surveillance pattern that hostile services would lose track of which intelligence operation was running. It was desperate, it was unauthorized, and it was the only option left. Yael Shahar discovered Roth's movement 4 hours later when she finally serviced the dead drop near the Landwehr Canal. The film canister she found wasn't the one she'd left. It was Roth's message to her, following Protocol 7. Estimate 48 hours to completion. Do not attempt contact. Protocol 7, the self-exfiltration doctrine, the scenario where the asset becomes autonomous operator because command structure has collapsed. Shahar felt ice in her chest. Protocol 7 meant Roth was choosing his own route, his own timing, his own deception strategy. It meant Mossad was no longer running this extraction. Their asset was. She encrypted a message back to Tel Aviv using a one-time pad and a coded commercial advertisement in a West Berlin newspaper. The message was 3 words long. Asset is autonomous. The response came 12 hours later through the same channel. Support, but do not direct. Let him run. For the next 36 hours, Daniel Roth would operate without a safety net, without backup, without the assurance that Mossad even knew where he was. He would make decisions based purely on training, instinct, and the kind of operational improvisation that either saves lives or ends them. His first move was to reuse a location Mossad had abandoned 2 years earlier. The apartment on Kantstrasse had been a Mossad safe house from 1979 to 1981 until surveillance indicated that Soviet intelligence had identified it as suspicious. Not definitively compromised, but enough to warrant abandonment. Mossad's protocol was absolute. Once a location showed signs of attention, it was burned forever. You never went back. Roth went back. His reasoning was simple. If Soviet intelligence had identified the location as suspicious, but never confirmed it as a Mossad facility, they would have monitored it for a period and then classified it as a dead end. Burned locations got archived, surveillance resources got reassigned to active targets. Bureaucracy moved on. He was betting that the apartment was no longer under active watch precisely because it had been flagged and dismissed years ago. The gamble required understanding how intelligence services think. They don't have infinite resources. They can't watch everything forever. They make assessments, classify locations as active or inactive, and move surveillance assets to where they expect activity. The safest place to hide isn't where they've never looked. It's where they already looked and decided you weren't there. Roth entered the building at 2 a.m. using a key that had been hidden in a magnetic holder behind a heating vent in the building's basement. The key still worked. The lock hadn't been changed. The apartment was exactly as Mossad had left it 2 years earlier, furnished, maintained, and completely dormant. What Roth didn't know was that the apartment was still under surveillance. Not active human coverage, but passive technical monitoring. A camera system installed by East German intelligence that captured images every 6 hours and stored them on magnetic tape for periodic review. But the review process was weeks behind. Budget cuts had reduced the number of analysts assigned to monitoring burned locations. The cameras kept recording, but the tapes sat unwatched in a storage facility across the city, waiting for someone to have time to review them. Roth's appearance on tape wouldn't be discovered for another 3 weeks. By then, the extraction would be long over. He stayed in the apartment for 11 hours, sleeping for the first time in 2 days. When he woke, he executed the second phase of his improvised extraction, creating a decoy. The technique came from training scenarios about misdirection. If hostile surveillance is trying to track you, give them someone else to follow, not an agent, not someone who knows they're part of an operation, just a civilian whose movements happen to overlap with your profile enough to create confusion. Roth had identified his decoy 3 years earlier and never told Mossad about it. A German accountant named Friedrich Becker, who worked in the same office building, lived in the same neighborhood, and shared enough physical characteristics, height, build, hair color, that at a distance they could be mistaken for each other. Roth spent the afternoon near Becker's usual route home, timing his own movements to create visual echoes, walking the same streets 5 minutes later, entering the same shops, creating a pattern that would appear on any surveillance photograph as activity consistent with the target's profile. The goal wasn't to fool watchers completely. The goal was to create enough ambiguity that surveillance teams would report continued activity in expected patterns, to buy time by making them think they still had eyes on their target. By evening, Roth had generated enough false signals that he felt confident moving to the next phase, the one that would either get him out of Berlin or get him killed. The underground maintenance tunnels beneath the Stadtbahn ran for almost 2 kilometers through sections of the city where official maps showed nothing but railway infrastructure. They'd been built during post-war reconstruction, expanded during the 1970s, and known primarily to municipal engineers and maintenance crews. Mossad had learned about them through an Israeli commercial firm that had participated in rebuilding Berlin's rail system in the late 1960s. Engineering contractors see infrastructure no intelligence service bothers to classify. Blueprints, access points, routes that exist in municipal archives but never appear in security briefings. The firm had passed the information to Mossad as routine intelligence collection, the kind of data you gather without knowing if it'll ever matter. It sat in archives for 14 years before someone realized it might provide an extraction route that bypassed every checkpoint in the city. Roth entered the tunnel system through a maintenance access point near the Tiergarten at 11 p.m. The entrance was locked, but the padlock was cheap municipal hardware, not high security. He used a tension wrench and a pick he'd carried for 3 years without ever expecting to need them. The tunnels were dark, smelled of diesel fuel and rainwater, and extended in both directions with no visible signage. Roth moved west, using a penlight to check his direction every 50 meters, following the route he'd memorized from architectural drawings he'd studied once, months ago, during a routine briefing that had seemed academic at the time. The knowledge you carry matters most when plans collapse, when you can't call headquarters. When the playbook is gone and all you have is whatever you managed to memorize before everything went wrong. Roth emerged from the tunnel system 48 minutes later near the Charlottenburg station, 4 kilometers from where he'd entered. He'd bypassed 3 security checkpoints, 2 surveillance zones, and every street-level monitoring system that would have recorded his movement. He was now in the British sector, which meant different jurisdictional rules and different intelligence service coverage. The confusion of overlapping authority was Berlin's curse and its gift. If you could move between sectors fast enough, you could outrun the coordination required to track you. Roth walked to a 24-hour cafe near the Savignyplatz and ordered coffee. He sat by the window watching the street, waiting for the courier who was supposed to arrive at 2 a.m. if the Protocol 7 sequence was still intact. The courier arrived at 2:14. A woman in her 30s carrying a leather portfolio case. She sat 3 tables away, ordered tea, and spent 20 minutes reading a magazine. When she left, the portfolio was under Roth's table. Inside was everything he needed for the next phase. A passport, travel documents, a wallet containing cash and credit cards, and a train ticket to Frankfurt departing at 6:45 a.m. The passport wasn't Israeli. It wasn't even recent. It was a Belgian identity created 19 years earlier, in 1964, as part of a long-term legend Mossad had established for reasons lost to institutional memory. The identity had been maintained meticulously, address updates, employment records, tax filings, by a section of Mossad that specialized in keeping dormant legends alive. The name in the passport was Michel Servais. His occupation was listed as technical sales representative. His photograph showed a younger Roth, but the aging was plausible. The identity had never been used operationally. It had simply existed, waiting. When the extraction crisis began, a Mossad analyst searching through archives for alternative identities had rediscovered Michel Servais almost by accident. The perfect escape hatch, an identity so thoroughly legitimate that even hostile intelligence services would find it impossible to connect to Israel. Roth stared at the passport and felt the weight of what was about to happen. He wasn't being extracted. He was being erased. Daniel Roth would cease to exist. The man who would walk through border checkpoints and board international flights would be Michel Servais, a Belgian nobody with a completely documented life that had nothing to do with intelligence operations. He would never see Berlin again, never return to the apartment where he'd lived for 5 years, never contact the girlfriend who thought she knew him, never access any part of the infrastructure that had made up his operational cover. The success of this extraction required his complete disappearance, not just from Berlin, but from his own identity. At 6:30 a.m., 41 hours before the extraction deadline, Roth walked into Berlin Hauptbahnhof carrying a single bag and a Belgian passport. He purchased a newspaper, found his platform, and boarded the train to Frankfurt exactly as the Michel Servais identity's established travel patterns would predict. The border guard who checked his passport at the checkpoint gave it a thorough examination, photo verification, stamp review, database check. The computer system returned a clean result. No flags, no alerts, no reason to detain. Survey was waved through. Somewhere in Tel Aviv, a monitoring system registered that Michel Servais had just activated. The identity had crossed from dormant to operational. The extraction was entering its final phase. But Roth didn't feel relief. He felt the absolute finality of what had just happened. The man who'd boarded this train wasn't going home. He was traveling toward a kind of death, the erasure of every connection that had defined his life before Mossad recruited him. I have to pause here and ask you something. If you were in his position, knowing that crossing that checkpoint meant you'd never return to your life, that your identity would be permanently erased, that everyone you'd known for 5 years would think you'd simply vanished, could you have walked through? What would you have done? Because the psychological cost of successful extraction is something intelligence agencies rarely discuss. Drop your answer in the comments below. I'm genuinely curious how you'd navigate that impossible choice, because what Roth decided in that moment defined the rest of his existence. Here's what happened next. The train reached Frankfurt 4 hours later. Roth, now Servaes, transferred to a flight to Brussels using documentation that showed a routine business trip. Belgian citizen returning home after technical consultations in Germany. Nothing remarkable. Nothing suspicious. The flight departed at 2 p.m. By 4:30, Servaes was on Belgian soil, passing through customs with the ease of someone whose identity had been verified by systems that found absolutely nothing irregular. From Brussels, the extraction route took him to Paris, then to a private airfield outside Lyon, where a corporate aircraft waited with no flight plan, filed, and no passenger manifest recorded. The aircraft, owned by a shell company Mossad had established years earlier for exactly this purpose, took off at 11 p.m. and landed in Tel Aviv 6 hours later. Daniel Roth had left Berlin. Michel Servaes had disappeared somewhere over the Mediterranean. The man who emerged in Israel at dawn had no name that appeared in any official record of the operation. The extraction had taken 79 hours from initial compromise to final arrival, 17 hours ahead of the deadline. By any operational metric, it was a success, but Mossad's internal review told a different story. The debriefing lasted 3 days. Analysts from operations, planning, and security sections examined every decision, every deviation from protocol, every moment when the extraction had nearly collapsed. Their assessment was brutal. Operation Grey Morning had succeeded not because of Mossad's planning, but in spite of it. The over-compartmentalization that was supposed to protect the operation had instead nearly paralyzed it. When communication broke down, different sections of the organization didn't have enough information to coordinate effectively. The courier detained by West German intelligence hadn't known enough about the operation to explain why her presence mattered. The surveillance teams monitoring Roth's movements couldn't share information fast enough to support his improvised route. Protocol 7, the self-exfiltration doctrine, had saved the operation precisely because it abandoned the command structure entirely. Roth had survived by making decisions headquarters couldn't predict, and therefore couldn't compromise. The lesson was uncomfortable but clear. Sometimes the safest intelligence operation is the one your own organization doesn't control. Multiple protocols were rewritten after Grey Morning, communication systems redesigned. Compartmentalization rules adjusted to allow faster coordination during crisis scenarios. Training programs expanded to emphasize agent autonomy and improvisation. But the most significant change came in the psychological evaluation protocols. Roth's debriefing revealed cognitive patterns that evaluators classified as permanent operational damage, not PTSD, not breakdown, something more subtle and more disqualifying. The 79 hours of sustained stress, constant decision-making under threat, and the complete erasure of his former identity had created what one psychologist described as fragmentation of operational personality. He could function, he could think clearly, but he could no longer maintain the kind of deep cover that required total immersion in a false identity. The part of his mind that had allowed him to be Daniel Roth for 5 years without breaking character had been damaged by the necessity of abandoning that identity completely. Mossad's verdict was final. Operationally effective but unsuitable for future field deployment. Roth was offered a position in training, teaching the self-exfiltration techniques that had saved his life. He declined. He was offered analytical work, applying his understanding of hostile surveillance systems to help other assets avoid his fate. He declined. He asked for complete severance from Mossad. No contact, no pension, no ongoing relationship. His request was granted. The man who'd been Daniel Roth and briefly Michel Servaes disappeared into complete anonymity. Mossad's personnel files contained no forwarding address, no contact information, no way to reach him if they needed to. He'd executed a final extraction, this time from the intelligence service itself. The codename Operation Grey Morning was assigned 6 months after the operation concluded, during an internal training review. Someone noted that the final exit from Berlin had occurred just before dawn. At that moment, when the sky holds no clear color, when darkness hasn't quite surrendered to light. Gray morning, the hour of ambiguity.
And that was the Mossad. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you that you're not neutral and that the government has no rights.